Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. So in our previous lesson, we were explaining the preface of daily bread, the importance of bread, the symbolicism of bread, and the wordplay involved with regards to that. Okay? And the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu that's collected by Imam Ahmad in his Musnad that talks about one of the phenomena towards the end of time, the end of this world, which is time becoming short or very closely stuck together, and what's meant by that and what the ulama of Islam say regarding that. Then we went on to mention the next discussion, or the first chapter of the book, the first hadith of the book, which is, should you get married first, or should you go overseas and study first and then get married? And we mentioned the famous narration of Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu in the Sahihain with regards to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam advising the youth to marry and encouraging the youth to marry, and why it is important and virtuous to get married, and the cure and the remedy for those who cannot afford to get married. Right. Here we have quoted the entire hadith. As you can see, we have not just mentioned the main part of the metin, Ya ma'shar al-shabab, O assembly of youth. Rather, we mentioned that which is called sabab al-tahdith, why the sahabi told another sahabi of the hadith, or told one of the tabi'een of the hadith, why one of the tabi'een narrated from the sahabi to another tabi'i, etc. So there is sabab al-wurud, and then there is sabab al-tahdith, two different things, similar to asbab al-nuzul. So why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said something, and why a sahabi passed on the Prophet's words to another sahabi or to another tabi'i, or a tabi'i to another tabi'i, etc. So there is sabab al-wurud, why the Prophet said it, and then there is sabab al-tahdith, why the disciples of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed it on to others. And of course, these asbab, these reasons behind these hadiths, without a question, they will aid you, they will assist you, they make it easier ala fahm al-muradi min al-matin, understanding what's meant by the hadith, and also giving you a greater depth of the matin, and also giving you a greater sense of istinbat from the matin, how the hadith is to be used. So there is Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Abdullah bin Mas'ud, the two companions, and then there's Alqamah, the tabi'i, at Mina making hajj. He said to him, let us not marry you off to a young girl. You've gotten a little old, you're older, you're gray. Maybe this young woman will put more life back into you, so on and so forth. Khairan insha'Allah ta'ala. And of course, there are fawaid that pertain to that qissa and to that sabab. And that is from, as we have explained, what is from ulum al-hadith. This is a type of ilm of ulum al-hadith. Just like from ulum al-Quran is asbab al-nuzul. And in ilm al-hadith there is asbab al-wurud. And then there's also asbab al-tahdith. So that's why we actually have the hadith. What Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu said to Ibn Mas'ud, and Ibn Mas'ud obviously was a little older. So now focusing on the metin, it says, Ya ma'ashar al-shabab. And this proves, just like it's mentioned in other ahadith, Inna ma'ashar al-anbiya. Okay, the word ma'ashar is used in many texts. Assembly, gathering, collection. All youth should listen and pay attention. Man istata'a minkum al-ba'ata falyatazawwaj. Whoever can marry should do so. The scholars of Islam, they differ on this word ba'a. Al-ba'a. What's meant by ba'a? Some scholars, they say al-ba'a yani mu'na nikah. Taklifatun nikah is the actual costs of marriage. You having the money to provide for a woman, put food in her mouth, clothing on her back, and a roof over her head. Whoever has the financial stability to marry should do so, must do so, etc. Another scholars, they say من استطاع منكم الباءة يعني القدرة على الجماع, sexual maturity. If you're pubescent, you're of age, you're sexually mature, you have desires, you have the ability to reproduce, you need to fulfill those desires in a permissible way. So those are the two interpretations of the scholars of Al-Islam. And it's a very long discussion on which of those two interpretations is actually maqsood huna. The Prophet ﷺ saying, if you have the money to get married, then do so. And who cannot get married, he should fast. If you have the desires to get married, then do so. And whoever can't get married, as if there's a connection or correlation between both. So that's what's meant by that meaning, or that part of the hadith, al-ba'a, from the vocabulary of the hadith, and from the things that a person should aspire and look after and desire and long for when studying any text, any book of hadith, is increasing his lugha. And one of the ways that you'll increase your lugha is through the gharib, sharh al-gharib. That's what they taught us in Kulliyat al-Hadith. And this was what some of the mashayikh and some of the doctors taught us, which were from the ahdaf al-madda. Ahdaf al-madda, the objectives of the course. The objectives of the course was to enrich the students' lugha through the sunnah. Let alone the mabahith nahwiyah lughawiyah, the different issues and different styles of lugha and Arabiya mentioned in the hadith as well. Moving forward. So it says, من استطاع منكم الباءة فليتزوج. The hadith says fal, and this is what is called lamul amr. The Prophet ﷺ is commanding and ordering the youth to get married. Now, the overwhelming majority of the scholars, they hold the view that getting married is not obligatory. They hold the view that it's only recommended to get married. Unless إِلَّا مَنْ خَشِيَ لَعَنَتْ, he who fears falling into sin and haram, then they say he or she must get married. And if they don't want to get married, then they say يَجِبُ التَّسَرِّي. Then there's either marriage or concubinage. In other words, they hold the view that if you are afraid of falling into haram with regards to your sexual desires, you either have to get married or you have a concubine. Obviously, in 2020, when was the last time that the Muslims have collectively, systematically waged war, fought a war, captives taken, so on and so forth, as a whole? Here and there, certain parts of the world, we're not denying that. All right? And the concept of a concubine, is that permissible in Islam, and what's meant by that? So in our times, 2020, basically is just getting married. So therefore, the overwhelming majority of the scholars, they say that a person does not have to get married unless they are afraid of falling into sin. The overwhelming majority hold the view that marriage is mustahab, recommended. Some scholars say that it is obligatory when a person fears anat. And others, they say that if you don't get married, then you have to do one of the two. If marriage is not obligatory, then tasarri is. And some people, they make a mistake. When they quote certain scholars, say, Fulan, this scholar never got married, he was busy teaching ilm, he never got married, he lam yatazawwaj. That doesn't mean that he lam yatasarra. It doesn't mean that he never what? He had no woman. It doesn't mean that. But it doesn't mean that he never had a formal marriage. Tayyib. There are certain proofs and evidences that those scholars use to prove that marriage is only recommended. It's a long discussion. That's the view of most of the scholars, and other scholars may hold a different view. طيب. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ. Whoever cannot get married, then he has to fast. And this also is another qarina, it's another context clue that marriage is commanded. The asl, fil asl, that is obligatory. If who cannot do it. Alright? Moving forward. فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ وِجَاء. And that it is a means of literal, the word wija, يعني رد الخصيتين. رد الخصيتين أو قطع الخصيتين. Castration. And obviously the different types of castration, may Allah protect us from that. And from the types of castration is the removing or the smashing of one's testicles. That's one way of castrating. And unfortunately, there are other ways of castrating a male. With regards to the removal of the private part of the penis, or a large part of it. And there are some types of castration are even more gruesome than that, in which everything is cut and removed. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. And a person becomes a eunuch. A person becomes a what? A eunuch. So the hadith says, get married, and if you can't get married, then fast, because fasting works as castration. In other words, the eunuch doesn't have any desire and lust for women, and if he does have desire and lust for women, then it's very small, very minute. All right, and it's obviously a long discussion and much history involved in a eunuch and involved in castration in ancient China of more modern times, not necessarily modern, but closer, yani, to our times. The different sultans, the different caliphs, the leaders of the Muslims who had harems, obviously come from haram, meaning prohibited, in which this sultan, whether you talk about the Ottoman Empire or other than the Ottoman Empire, this leader, this caliph, this sultan has a harem, and in the harem he may have 20 women, 30 women, 10 women, all beautiful, exotic, extravagant women, right? Obviously, the sultan is busy. He's the leader of the state, the leader of the Muslims. Let alone he may have 2 or 3 other wives. He may have 4 wives. He has children. He has wars to fight, taxes to collect, so many things to do. He doesn't have the time and the ability to be with them intimately every day and every night. But at the same time, he wants them to be there when he needs them. And the harem obviously wasn't just about sex, but it was also about producing more children and spreading more royal blood. There's a very widespread misconception that many people have about anyone who had a harem, let alone the Ottoman sultans, okay? And that it was just about lust and desires. It was deeper than that. And they realized that their wives didn't always bear children. One wife is pregnant, another one is breastfeeding, one wife is sick, one wife is in another part traveling, he's in the need of producing as many heirs as possible, as many warriors as possible, and as much noble blood as possible. So therefore, who was going to be in charge of these women? Who was going to look after them, take care of them, make sure that they were safe, make sure that they weren't running away or escaping, making sure they weren't up to any mischief or havoc? There had to be someone who was in charge of them. And oftentimes they were placed in charge of those lonely, abandoned, neglected, beautiful young women. It's a problem. They couldn't have a normal man there because, for obvious reasons. So they thought and they felt that the best alternative was a mute, huh? Allahumma stan. It's technically muted, a eunuch. A person who's what? He has no lust for women. If not, then is what? Very weak. And if it is weak, it's not much he can do. Think about the wisdom of this. Unfortunately, even if he does something, there is never no fear of harboring a child from ignoble blood. You understand? Even if he does do something, or she can never get pregnant from him. So the child that she bears is always going to be his child. That was the way that they looked at it. And there were other wisdoms of having eunuchs, imperial eunuchs, in the court as their servants, as their protectors. Even many warriors were eunuchs. And that's because obviously a eunuch, unfortunately, he's half of a man. His manhood has been taken from him. He's been emasculated. All right? Or the eunuch would be extremely loyal to the master, because I don't have much to look forward to. I never have the desire to get married. Can't marry no woman. I can never have my own children. I can never start my own family. So why not stay here and remain loyal, make the best out of my life as a servant and as a slave to this leader, this emperor, this Khan, whoever, whatever cultural reference you use. Everyone understands this? Unfortunately. Also, there is the history of eunuchs and emasculation, castration in Western Europe and Christendom. There were many different denominations of Christians. Many of them were extreme. Many of them were overzealous. And their devotion towards Christ and God and the Mother of God, according to them, waliyadu billah, and many of them proved devotion to God through self-castration. Wala hawla wala quwwata illa billah. Self-castration. A man would what? Castrate himself. And that was the ritual of walking over hot coals. That was the proof, that was the test that I'm devoted to Christ, devoted to God. I've done it. What could be more devotion than what? Than that type of pain and that mindset that you have to have. So the point is that castrating men is something which is very old and very popular, unfortunately. And then there's the concept of castrating an animal. Is it permissible to neuter or spade an animal, a male cat or a female cat? Can you do that? Is it permissible to neuter or spade a horse? Is it permissible for a neuter or spade a dog? Is it permissible for a goat or sheep to be castrated? All right? Chickens and roosters, can they be castrated? And the reason why they castrated those animals was they say the taste of the meat, the smell of the meat, and the texture of the meat is greatly affected through the emasculation of the animal. That the meat is better, it tastes better, it doesn't smell as bad and putrid when it has been what? Castrated. And the fiqh of the different animals in the different ages. Lamb, sheep, ram, ewe, all right? The different ages and how the meat develops. When is it mutton and when is it lamb? Everyone understand this? There's a fiqh behind that. What's important is in Islam, it is prohibited to castrate a human. Haram. It cannot be done. And the scholars of Islam, they differ on the permissibility or the impermissibility of castrating an animal. Many say the same ruling applies to a human. It cannot be done. And others, they say it's permissible listitabatil lahm, for the maslahat, the greater benefit of the food and the taste of the food for the humans. But many scholars say that it's punishing and it is a means of changing the law's creation, and castration cannot be done. Now we have the modern day applications such as going to the vet, getting a cat, going to Petco or PetSmart. Can you get a cat that is already fixed? Are you assisting them in that? And this obviously was one of the problems of the Muslims in the past. The Muslims themselves didn't, or if they did, they were sinful. They weren't supposed to castrate any slaves. But they wanted castrated slaves to look over my wife, my children, and my harem of women. So oftentimes they will buy the castrated slaves from the Christians of Egypt, Christians of Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, these parts. Now, from one aspect, one says it's permissible to buy the slave, to purchase the slave that's castrated. I didn't castrate him. But at the same time, the supply and the demand for castrated slaves is pushing the people to do what? To do it. I have these boys here, these men here. I have 10 slaves. I want to castrate all of them because I know it's going to be a huge demand from these Arab or Turkish or whatever Euro-Asian Muslims to buy castrated slaves. So the Muslim who purchases them and buys them, in actuality, he's playing a hand in the castration of that human being. And of course, the castration of those slaves was very gruesome, very horrific, and the mortality rate, the death rate was very horrific. As just a fact on the side. It wasn't like it was maybe 7 out of people would die. Maybe more than that. Okay, there were many atrocities committed to many human beings in that process, unfortunately. What's important is that that's what's meant by that part of the hadith, wija', and that's a fa'idah pertaining to history and all things what? They're connected from one thing we learn, 10,000 other things. So that's the maqsood of that part of the hadith, wija'. It's like as if it's a castration. In other words, fasting cuts off your desires. It lowers your desires. It weakens your body. It makes you focus. It makes you concentrate. It makes you have a better your lenses, you're more focused on ibadah. You're more conscious of Allah. That's what's meant by that, let alone the actual weakness of the body. And the Prophet ﷺ telling us that the shaitan walks with the son of Adam like blood flows through the veins. And fasting obviously does what? هذا هو ذهب الظمأ وابتلت العروق. Right? Now, so that's what's meant by that hadith. Other scholars, they extract from this hadith, they say that this hadith proves the impermissibility of masturbation. If masturbation was lawful, then the Prophet would have said, then do it. But he didn't say that, but he said, fast. And obviously it's easier to masturbate than it is to fast. And the scholars of Islam, they differ on that issue. Is it or is it not permissible to masturbate? Right. That's just a fa'idah. Janibiyya. Moving forward. Also, the ruling on taking something that would change one's desires. Is it permissible? Back in the day, used to call it saltpeter. If there's a jail full of men, full of women, they will put certain things in the food to lower their desires. There was a rumor, unfortunately, in the Islamic University of Medina that was full of men, no women, is that they put what? Saltpeter in the food. They would say this. When I got there, they said this. And their brothers, they would say, don't eat from the cafeteria in Medina. If you eat from the cafeteria every day, you go home to your wife, what? You won't have any masculinity left in you. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. So they said this. All right. And the scholars of Islam, they have mentioned that a person, can take something to lower or to get rid of his desires only if it's temporary. Only if it's temporary. And he cannot take something which would totally make him sterile. Abadan. It's impermissible to do that. Everybody clear on this? Tayyib. So those are the main fawaid of the hadith and the general meaning of the hadith. How does this hadith pertain to the first chapter? Get married first to go overseas. The answer is clear. Is that the Prophet's guidance and advice was to get married first. But that does not mean that you get married with nothing under your belt. Study a little bit, have a couple juz, then you get married, then you go overseas together. Because when you get married, you are going to be busy. There are going to be responsibilities. There's attention that you have to give to this woman, that you have to give to this man. So the general answer is that marriage comes before ilm, especially living in a time and a place in which you fear zina. You fear the haram. That comes before going overseas, going to Medina, going to Egypt. That's the answer to the question. But in certain instances, and in certain cases, of course, there are different khusus, specific rulings that go away from the asr. So the general rule is that you should get married first, and 9% of the scholars, of the great scholars of Islam, were married. 9 out of 10, 90% is what I mean. Not most of them were married. And there were a few rarities. Imam Taymiyyah this, Nawawi that. Once Imam Ahmad's wife died, he never got remarried. He only had a concubine. So that was rare. The majority of the ulama were what? Mutazawijun. And the virtue of zawaj, the beauty of zawaj, and how zawaj brings about righteous children that will make dua for you when you die and when you pass and leave this life. However, it doesn't mean that you just marry anyone and everyone. You have to be selective within that. Marry a woman that sees like you. And of course, this is a very, very long discussion. We can go on and on and on about the fiqh of choosing a wife when it comes to talab ilm and the mistakes that people make. Women, they marry a brother who's a student of knowledge and they're not studious. They're only marrying him because he's cute, he's handsome, he's funny, he dresses nice, or they like his ilm. They like the fact that he's religious, but they're not actually, they're not hardcore. And it's good, it goes well. 1 baby, 2 babies, Medina, Egypt, Yemen, here and there. Next thing you know, the fights come, the arguments come, the complaining comes. I want you to dress like this. Why I gotta wear thobe every day? Wear pants. Just once a week, twice a week. Why do you have to study so much? Why do you have to spend so much money on books? Why are we not having the problems that come up if she's not what? It's reality. So you have to realize that you gotta marry someone similar to you, to the best of your ability. And if you can't marry someone that's similar to you, maybe rare to find a husband like you, maybe rare to find a wife like you got to find something that's halfway close and someone that respects the ilm and respects the art and the science of what? Seeking knowledge. So certain brothers, I would say for sure, don't get married first. Go graduate and then come back. And other brothers, I would say you need to what? Get married first. And some brothers will be a mixture. Everyone understand the ruling? So that's what's meant by that bab. And that's the answer to that question. It depends. There is tafsil. There's what? There's tafsil. But that is the default. And that is the sunnah. And the barakah that comes from zawaj. And last but not least, if you're a true student of knowledge, no matter what, no matter how many wives, babies, bills, diapers, pampers, no matter what is going on in your life, you're always going to be a student of knowledge. And if you're a fake student of knowledge, may Allah protect us and hide our shortcomings. If you're not really devoted to it, if you're not really dedicated to it, or you're devoted and dedicated, but you're not the top tier, the talent, you're built like that, it's going to become clear. It's going to become manifested, and divorce is going to take you away from ilm. Your wife is going to take you away from ilm. This person being sick, this family member is going to what? But the real thought of ilm is never ever what? Evident. As a pause, I'm not doing it as much as I used to, but he's always going to be married to knowledge. So it's all about إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. What's your intention and where your heart is connected and how is your heart is connected, and nothing and no one can prevent you from studying knowledge. Period. You were strong in the beginning, but then you quit, then you stopped. That's because it wasn't that strong. But if you're really devoted to it, none will take you away from the ilm. All right? So if that's the case, if you're going to be able to seek knowledge no matter what, then why not get married? But who you get married to. And what's meant by not having everything, lacking a few things, you don't have that much money to get married, versus you have nothing. All right, so that's a very, very long discussion. We'll stop here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surely knows best. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam wa barak ala abdihi wa rasulihi nabina wa imamina Muhammad.